I think we have started the webinar. Hello and welcome. Do we need to wait a minute or two for any more folks to hop in, or can we just get going? I'm just gonna get going. All right.
Yeah, let's go.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. We've got a number of auspicious folks with us here today to talk about tokens, and I'm gonna share my screen a little bit so we can get some slides out of the way real fast. We are talking tokens today. Uh, I'm Chris Bloom, dev here at Knapsack. I really like tokens, and I'm excited to talk to the folks that we're going to be talking to. Uh, First off, quick little announcement. We've got another upcoming webinar. March 26th, we're going to be talking about accessible experiences in design systems, how to make design systems accessible first. We have some neat folks we'll be talking to about that as well, so please sign up for that if you can. We also have the Patterns event in San Francisco, March 13th. April 24th in Chicago, and May 15th in New York City. Get a bunch of knapsackers and other guests on stage, and we talk about design systems. As you can tell, we like design systems, we like tokens, and we're putting on a number of these events. So please get with us. Hit us at knapsack.cloud slash events. The .cloud is very important, slash events, and let's talk patterns. So we got a couple of speakers today, and I'm going to have y'all introduce yourself, but I'll just run through the names here really quick. We have Jackie, Donnie, and Miranda, and they all deal with tokens in various ways throughout their work. And if you could please, I'm going to stop sharing just so that we can see your faces. Jackie, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. Jackie Lai here. I'm with Opus, a Dow Jones company, and I'm the lead UX designer here. And a part of my position is to handle infrastructure projects and design system tokens and all that good stuff. It falls under the infrastructure project. Another part would be product development and product design. And that would be something that is also on my plate. Over to Donnie.
Hey folks, Donnie D'Amato here. I'm founder and chief architect of a company called Design Systems House, where we're dedicated to future design systems. As I think many folks on the webinar might know, that I'm very into design tokens. Maybe a small part of you might know that I have a very strict definition when it comes to those tokens. That's related to a approach that I call Mise-en Mode, which helps do multi-brand, multi-theming things in a more accessible way for a lot of folks. So in order to do that correctly, design tokens is a big part of that. And I'm definitely here for my insight into the research that I've done over the number of years for that.
Awesome. Miranda, tell us about yourself. You are muted.
That's what I said about tech this morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Miranda Bouck. I'm a staff product designer at Instacart. I work on our consumer design system called Pantry, which then gets themed into multiple design systems across multiple products. I've been working on design systems for about 8 years. My previous was the uniform design system at Huddle, a video technology company. My favorite thing about them is taking tiny little problems and making them large scale solutions. So I know that sounds pretty niche, but that's I think why everybody's here, because tokens definitely fits that.
Thank you all for being here. Let's nerd out about tokens. I'm not going to leave this slide up for very long, but I do have a set of general categories we're going to talk about. We're probably not going to get to all of these, but here they are. I'm going to flash them up on screen before I ask y'all some specifics. All right, we will have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. Feel free to dump your questions into chat. I believe Zoom has a specific ask a question feature. Please use that. All right, so I'm going to start with let's talk about roles. Let's talk about roles for people who do tokens in organizations. What roles for tokens do you have specifically within your organization? Is a tokens person a title? Is it separate from the overall design system? How do you categorize people who do this within your organization?
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Donnie.
No, go ahead. I was just, who wants to
Yeah, I
start?
before we jump into that, I just wanted to point out, like, naming tokens is such an interesting and in-depth field, and it has history in scientific naming, infrastructure, in information naming system, and then um, it it really expands to in-depth idea about naming things, and then it also ties to your organization's goals and your culture and how things runs, what's important to your company. So, but unfortunately, like for a lot of companies, token naming isn't really part of um, a specialized role. It's like we all like. I'm doing naming tokens, but then I'm not specialized in that. And I can, to see what Donnie and Miranda has to say for other organizations, but for us, it isn't a particular specialized role.
Yeah, the same is true at Instacart. I think it would be kind of risky to have a single person be the one and only tokens person. I kind of live and die by the hit by a bus theory. Or that somebody goes on vacation and then everything is gone. So at least on our team, it's a pretty wide group effort. I can say single-handedly, like I'm kind of driving the workflow, but I can't do it by myself. So I'm working very closely with our staff content designer, Rachel. She's helping us with our nomenclature, like how do we categorically separate things. I'm also working with our engineers to make sure that there's certain things that we can avoid, or, things we've already established that we should fold into our system. That definitely wouldn't happen by myself. So I would say there's probably 5 people contributing, but there is definitely not a single person responsible for tokens.
It's interesting we're talking about the naming directly with the roles thing, because I actually think about the roles not necessarily with the naming, because I'm thinking about, okay, there's a couple of different roles that are sitting in the space that require to work with tokens. So as a really good example of that is like, you'll have someone that's creating a theme, let's call it like the Valentine's Day theme for your brand, right? That person isn't necessarily like naming tokens there. They're going to be working with the existing tokens that were potentially provided to them and then assigning values to them. That's what I call curation, right? They're going to curate values to existing tokens to then convey what it means to be the Valentine's Day theme. So that's one role that's basically like the brand manager or marketer or whatever, the person that's trying to convey a brand or an expression that way. So they're working with tokens there. And then on the complete opposite side, there are people working with the tokens to apply that token to a place in the UI such it does get that value, right? So there's probably an engineer, maybe a designer as well, that is taking a token and saying, okay, where does this token go in the interface such that it gets the right value? So there's another person that's implementing that. And then certainly there's a person in the middle that's trying to determine what that connection looks like. And that's, I think, where the naming part comes in, such that the person who's curating a value has a good understanding about where that value is going to end up once it gets to the interface. And similarly, that person who's assigning the token to an interface part knows that they're applying it to the right place because of the naming. So the naming part obviously is important. I'm sure we'll get more into that later. But in terms of roles, I've always seen it as what I would like to call 3 individual roles, right, for those 3 sections. But what happens very often is that you'll have a team that ends up doing 2 of those roles. So maybe those 2 roles are the curation and the naming, or maybe it's the naming and the application, right, or the execution. And what happens there is that people get confused about what part of the role that they're going to be in, such that, like, they'll introduce their own bias to the naming such that it works out for them in the curation step, or it works out for them in the execution step. And that's like the gray area that ends up happening. But me personally, I like the very specific roles about what you're supposed to be doing and identifying that that's happening.
Do y'all find there naturally sort of arrives a token steward, right? Someone who is pushing this along. Miranda, you mentioned that's kind of you, right? Someone who's like most passionate about this, most understands this. Is there naturally someone who kind of rises to that role?
I say there has to be.
Yeah, I think
I'm a token tyrant, honestly.
Token
I have like I
tyrant.
said, I have a very strict definition when it comes to the tokens that I deal with. And any deviation from that isn't going to work at the vision that I have for tokens. Now, granted, like, it's entirely possible to have additional tokens, and I have systems that do like customization there. But when it comes to the North Star of what I see the system is providing to be as scalable as possible, it's important for the tokens to have a system behind them, and maintaining that system needs to be, done in a way that is regular and has consistency and has a pattern behind it.
Yeah. I also agree with Donnie because when I first started a design system that utilizes one of our product as a pilot, I created all of my design tokens, and then I use Figma Token Studio to host that. And then it has its own logic, it has its own patterns. And in order for it to expand in a way that I want it to, it has to follow a certain logic to it. You can't deviate from that logic. And if there are different patterns or different directions, different business needs, that will kind of branch out of that, but still has to follow the same logic. And if it doesn't, then you get to that restart again.
Yeah, and I would say from our perspective, like it's a team effort to kind of do that. Like I kind of steward, the spreadsheet behind this kind of thing. But our engineers are also aware, like if there's another team trying to create something, even just yesterday, we had an engineer come in and say that, hey, this doesn't look like our colors or our type tokens. Like, is this something we should be adding? And so like it becomes a team effort to make sure that we're managing and governing those tokens. And if we do need to figure out like, okay, maybe we need to expand something or add something new, we kind of come as a group consensus. So we all feel a little bit of ownership in it.
Awesome. Um, you know, talking about tokens and the responsibilities and the governance around this, that feels like, there's a lot of thought and there's a lot of planning that goes into tokens, but I'd love to hear about your experience starting from scratch with the understanding we're going to start with tokens versus something that already exists and we have to backport tokens into it, right? Because I know, every design system isn't perfect. Sometimes we go, oh, this is something we need to add in later. What are your experiences in that kind of design system life cycle of starting with tokens or trying to get them in later?
I can say I've been on both sides, and it's so much easier to do it greenfield. When you're creating a design system and you're like, okay, we're going to create these components and then we're going to have to implement them and migrate everything over to the design system. It's so much easier to define and set things up for success through a brand new design system. I'm currently in a situation where we're like backing the tokens into our system.
Okay.
The system's been around for about 5 years. We're going through a major migration, and everyone's very familiar with our primitive level, but we don't have any semantic level stuff. And so there's a mountain to climb in education of getting people's mental models to shift over from referencing like grayscale 0 to actually this is going to be button label. And so there's a whole
Semantic.
different
All right.
ballgame and a whole different strategy to implement tokens at that level than it is just saying we created a token palette and we think we're going to start here and we're going to build a button component and then implement it and shift things as necessary. Though I will say, in my previous design system, we learned the hard way too. It kind of goes back to the naming. Our very first breaking change was fixing the names of some of our tokens because we named things like I can't remember, it was like electric blue or something, and people were like, I don't know what this means. Or how do I reference it? So there's definitely trade-offs. I wouldn't say that one is like preferred because I don't think you can choose, but being on the greenfield startup from a design system from nothing is easier, so to speak, than backing it in, at least from my perspective.
Plus
Yeah.
one, Miranda. Plus one. I mean, I can't. The amount of a mental model shift that it needs to take to go from a color red 500 to something semantic is still a problem today. And I think when we finally unlocked dark mode as a concept, that's, I think, the best thing in terms of explaining to people, hey, this thing can't just be white. It's not going to be white forever. There's going to be a situation where the background is going to be dark. And it doesn't make sense for us to, have this conditional that says, if this, then put this color in, and if this, put this color in, at this level of the page where we have to bother engineers to do that kind of conversion. We want to take that away from the complications and just say there's a variable in here that could either be black or white, without suggesting that it is either black or white. That is literally just, page background or something like that. So that mental model shift is the biggest hurdle when getting into what we need to do in the token land.
I agree. Yeah, definitely when you start from the beginning to set up your token logic, it's easy in a way. But at the same time, when I was doing it, I was both the consumer as well as the designer for it. So I had to battle myself, have these mental fights with myself and trying to rationalize some of the decisions that I made. And then to your point, Miranda, to adopt a new system is a whole different thing. Like adopting tokens in a new system is a whole new ball game. And on top of that, to merge between the two different systems, that's even tougher. So it's like 3 different levels of challenges.
Awesome. I like the insight around dark mode kind of being the thing that kicks this off, right? That, hey, do we really need tokens? It's like, well, I've got a value here and it needs to be one of two things, depending on some kind of context. That gets, I think, a lot of people thinking in this space, which is super awesome with tokens. Got a question for y'all. Naming. Let's talk about naming for just a second. How many tiers is too many tiers for naming tokens, right? We've got our 3, brand dark 500 we mentioned earlier. What about 4? What about 5? What
Don't give me an aneurysm, Chris. I don't want it.
what
Don't give me an aneurysm.
what is your experience? What do you
No.
prefer and what's too much?
Don't you freaking dare 5 freaking tiers. I don't need this
5
shit.
tiers.
Oh my God. I want the webinar to know that he already instigated in the email earlier about this particular question and knows that I'm going to be fired up. Here's the thing for me. Okay. And I write about this in a lot of stuff. Peter says I'm warming up. I say this in a lot of the work that I do, that I do truly believe that you could have a fully covered system with a single tier of tokens if you name them correctly. And that single tier being semantic tier, that depends, of course, on it being well defined, like I was saying earlier about being the token tyrant. So the primitive level of tokens, in my opinion, is really only for 2 reasons, and it's both human-related reasons. Number one being that you want to convey the idea of this specific red to somebody. It's much easier to say color red 500 than it is to say hash FF66CC, right? Like that's very cumbersome to say. So it's a lot easier to just say color red 500. It's like, okay, I know that's a red. I know it's somewhere in the middle is fine. And the second reason that we have those primitive tokens is to reduce the amount of kinds of red that we could potentially choose from. So we reduce that to the 10 or 12 or whatever it is, such that it makes it easier for us to choose. Hicks law, right? We want to make sure that we could choose easily by reducing that set. So that's why primitives exist. But you don't need primitives necessarily. You could assign values directly to semantic tokens and totally be fine. It's just that people feel like those tokens being there makes it more descriptive to a human. It's totally fine. On the other side, which I was on a webinar last year with a couple of folks for Supernova, we talked about component tokens and how I'm also against component tokens. That's because they are too specific to the interface, right? So basically, if you wanted to change the modal backdrop color, sorry, not the modal backdrop, but the modal background color separately from any other surface in the system, that starts to deviate your consistent system look and feel, right? So you having all these specific little things that you can tweak makes everything a lot less and less consistent. And it also makes it such that you have to curate more and more values to cover the entire system. When instead, when you do a semantic token, you can generalize it and say all surfaces at this level are this background color, all surfaces this way are this background color. So that makes it a lot simpler to handle.
Yeah. Kevin and I, we had a lot of discussions when it comes to which tier of tokens that we should, publicize, right? So semantic layer is definitely the key to go about doing things because you have better control of how it's used with the intent that you want it to be used. Definitely, like, to Donnie's point, having that primitive token is basically a way to reduce the amount of choices because you have the gamut of all the colors that's out there, but it's reduction. So it forces you to work with what you have and maybe around 10 to 12, whatever it is. But then from then on, you assign the semantic token, however you want it to express your brand and your what you wanted to do. And then only, like, this is the only set of tokens that should be released. And then when it comes to component tokens, Kevin again and I, we did some calculations on this, and just the button alone, we put in all of the different variations for a button. And we're not even done with all of the buttons, and we already got to over 100 tokens. And the sheer amount of tokens that you have to keep track of just for a button component is way too overwhelming, and nobody can keep track of that. So it's better, and this is something that I always wanted to but push for, is to keep the component token in the code level and not something that the design system people have to write.
It doesn't go back upstream to the
doesn't.
root token definition.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, we're similar, though there are certain component level tokens that we do have to support, mainly because of our enterprise customers. We have a system that supports native web, and then we have everything that's changed based on an omni-channel presence. And so in order for us to actually theme things like buttons, because people want to change the look and feel of their quarter radius, or if it's got a border or whatever, certain component levels are required for that in order for us to avoid on that side of the house over customization and configuration for each of those people. And we can just manage that at the design system level. But there's definitely a line because, and I will say, just because some components have component level tokens does not mean that all need component level tokens also.
Yeah.
We're very specific. Yes, you could potentially change everything with a headless theme to make it look completely different than what we provide, but there is a benefit to scope. And so we keep things a little bit smaller and say, these are the sets of components that are allowable for those configurations. So we'll allow for component level tokens to be there, but anything beyond that is crazy town to me.
Well, I would challenge that actually a little bit, because what's the line, right? How do you tell anyone, like, hey, these things over here, they're allowed to have component tokens, but these, they're not allowed to have component tokens. Like, that's the difficulty that I'm seeing here, is this, like, well, at what point do you draw that line, or do you not even have that line at all, and just like, oh, if component tokens exist, maybe that's okay, and I'm wondering where you would draw it.
So
Yeah,
this gets into the governance question I like to ask y'all, right? Which is, and Miranda, if you could take this one, right? Like, how do you handle, the rules of this system, right? How do you handle what's allowed, what's not allowed? How do you handle, specifics on implementation, when you're allowed to override or you're not allowed to override? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. It's definitely a work in progress. We have a pretty vocal engineering community and a vocal design community, and they feel pretty trusted to come to us through office hours or our Slack channels and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. And we also have retailers that are just like, no, I want this. And so there's definitely some level of business development on that side, whether or not we're going to allow for certain configurations, which is separate than the design system. But then from the design system's perspective itself, we're saying, we're only going to go this far. And the reason is because you shouldn't have to be thinking about the look and feel or the structural changes of these components, because the business value that we provide you is given through the design system. You shouldn't be reconsidering all of these data points and all of this consideration we've taken into it. We've done that work for you. You get that for free. The same thing is true with our accessibility, right? Like, they don't think about accessibility because we provide it. And so like they shouldn't be reconsidering some of that stuff, and we should not be giving them the option to reconfigure that unless they're willing to take on that burden themselves, right? Like if they're willing to change that, then the compliance then falls to them. And so when it comes to governance, we'll have designers or engineers saying, hey, we've got something, we're thinking about challenging this. And it typically starts with a conversation. And then we'll have that conversation and we'll either say, actually, I think this is a way you could go, or we have something else similar that you don't need to go this far. Obviously, it sounds really vague because you can't really give specifics, but it's just a really collaborative conversation and we end up reaching a good resolution. Sometimes we do make changes. I won't say that we go into every conversation with a flat out no, but we do tell people, like, have a good reason for why you want to change this and we'll consider it, because you know the product and the people better than we do. We want to support you, but if it doesn't match with the rest of the rules that we have, then it's going to have a hard time to get adopted and moved in.
Awesome. Does anybody else want to talk to us about governance?
I guess the
just
one thing I'll talk. Oh, okay, Jackie, go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Sorry. I just want to reiterate that the foundational tokens, like you can use them differently, but it's best not to use it and just not to even say it, because what end up happening is you have unintended consequences when it's being used elsewhere, right? Like for instance, let's say if we wanted to use our brand blue for the lake for mapping purposes, right? And then what if our brand blue changed to brand pink? What's going to happen to the lake in the mapping process? So you really have to think about how things are connected to each other, how it's related to each other. So in those cases, you have to create a separate tier 2 where it's consuming from separate color line in the foundational token area. Yep.
Donnie, if you have something.
The thing that I think about is I see a lot of folks doing like token workshops, especially like in the individual and their teams and things like that. And they're like, okay, how should we name these tokens? What would be helpful for you, et cetera. And I always find that to be very odd, because a mechanic doesn't necessarily ask its user, its driver, what the best brakes are to put into your vehicle, right? You're no expert. You just drive the car, right? You're no expert in the way that the brake is supposed to be working in your car. They're going to talk to other experts in mechanics and brakes and automobiles to determine what the best brakes are to put in your vehicle. So when it comes to governing how tokens work, that should be amongst experts, people who are working in this stuff, to determine what the best thing is. Just to Jackie's point about thinking about the system and how it affects the system as an organization across is something that is very, very specific as a role for an organization, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to support individual features. And if any individual feature designer comes in and says, hey, what about me? Don't worry, we're trying to take you into account. That's definitely happening, right? But on the flip side, your recommendation is typically specific to your use case, and we have to think about the general use case. So even if the thing that we're talking about is when we're saying, okay, what's the best brake to put in this vehicle, we're considering, unfortunately, all cars, right, at once, as opposed to your specific car at this time. And granted, like there are specific brakes that are for specific cars when I do this analogy here, but we're taking into account such that we can go ahead and maintain the right amount of tokens, right? Because if we had too many tokens, like every individual kind of brake, we'd have component tokens versus, having semantic where we only have 20 different kinds that do satisfy the majority of cases. And then the outliers we can handle, on the side in some other kind of, process.
Yeah.
You actually got into an area that somebody just asked a question about. Garth asks, do you run into people working around the token system where they feel like they don't have a voice in the governance, right? Like how do we, should we, you mentioned experts, right? We're making these decisions. We're trying to make this easy for you. You shouldn't be picking out your brakes. I got you covered. Just let us install the brakes. But that sort of situation, right? Folks who maybe want a voice or, don't have it. How do you handle that?
I think that goes right back to user research. Like you never ask the user, hey, do you like this? Right? You ask the user, can you do this? Right? And what that's getting out of there is it solving the problem? Right? So a person, or I'll put in the terms of the designer says, hey, I need this. Right? Well, when you actually speak with the designer, you get to the root of the problem, you get to the root of the thing that you're trying to actually do. And it's not the thing that's necessarily asking for. What they're trying to do is something broader or more specific or whatever. And that conversation might get you to a compromise such that you are continuing to use the system, but they also get what they want. And I think that's the education gap that comes in here sometimes, right? You think that you only have 20 tokens to work with, and you're like, oh my God, how do I only have 20 tokens? How am I supposed to put this background color on this thing? Well, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get the background color that you're looking for. Oh, I didn't know that. Great. Move on to the next education, session that I need to do with this person. And it's a slow slog, but you'll eventually, hopefully, get to some solutions without, a problem.
Yeah, it's definitely the office hours that helps a lot. And just to Donnie's point, like in the scientific naming system, taxonomy, like nobody can just go there and say, I'm going to name this species something, something. Everybody actually have to get like a master degree or doctor degree in order to contribute towards that naming system, because it follows certain logic and then it places things where it belongs, so that the next person pick up a new or see a new animal, they can map it back to the source or put it in the right category. That's why sometimes you say, like, you see that this animal is misnamed and then they change the name to something else, right? There's a reason behind that, so they could categorize them efficiently, like properly. Yeah.
The reality is we can't stop them from doing anything, right? Like we only own our code. We only own our tokens. There's nothing stopping someone from hard coding a hex code or creating their own token. I think what the real power comes from, what do you do with that once it's done, right? There are points in the process where you could meet and potentially rectify the solution before it even goes out to production, right? Like that's where an office hours or a conversation comes in, or maybe there's an educational gap, or there's an opportunity to update your documentation, right? Like that's like the beautiful moment. But moreover than not, it's, we need to ship this. We need to ship it now. The design system's not ready. You guys are slowing me down. You're blocking me. We're going to just go ahead and do this. We need to experiment and see what happens. And there's nothing from us, like there's nothing that we can do to stop them. And I think that's how design systems grow, because how else are you going to understand like additional use cases? We have kind of a rule where it's across 3 different products or 3 different surfaces that use the same thing, then it's gaining enough traction that we should probably start considering that it actually has a real solution or has a real need inside the design system. And so we've kind of taken the approach of divergent and converging a little bit, where it's go forth, do what you need to do. We're monitoring. We will guide you. If we think there's a good solution that's already existent, we'll strive you towards that. We can't stop you from doing anything anyway. Obviously, we want you to use the design system where we can. but if you can't, go ahead. And then we come back the following half or quarter or whatever and say, okay, this has started to proliferate across a couple different surfaces. Let's patternize that. Let's figure out what's happening. And if it actually makes sense, are they in alignment? Can we find an alignment? How can we actually make this work? And then we rectify the solution after. Because the reality is, we're not only just trying to be cutting edge to tokens and getting everybody the features they need for all of our components, but we're also trying to maintain a system that keeps breaking, or stuff needs to change, or we need to refactor something, or we're bringing it into a new product. Like, there's a lot of moving pieces and we can't hold all of them in the air. And this gives people the opportunity to test and experiment and see what can happen with us being in the know. And then we can figure out, how do we actually make this work long term?
How are y'all writing this down? How are you communicating this? I heard about office hours a minute ago, right? Hey, this is here, come talk to us, right? We're going to show you how to do this stuff. How are you putting this into digestible, communicatable, forms for not just, designers and developers, but let's go up the chain, right? Stakeholders, right? Folks that we have to convince the value of this. How does this become communicatable?
I love the communication parts of design systems. We release a bi-weekly newsletter for each of our sprints. We follow Scrum loosely. And so every sprint, we will catalog what we've done, from the Figma library to the documentation to upcoming initiatives to the web, Android, and iOS packages. Everybody contributes to that, and we post that through Slack. Eventually, it will live on our doc site. We also have specific newsletters now that are going for like the two different variants of the design system, the tooling system and our Caper Cart hardware system. From there, that's more like IC manager level. We'll pitch things in management meetings, make sure everybody's kind of keeping up with that information. It's available all the time. People can search for it. We're talking about it in our office hours. But then when we're trying to raise things up the chain, we actually have a quarterly meeting with our leadership team. And we're giving updates on what's happened, what we're going after, why it matters, the logic behind the mayhem of why we choose to work on what we do. Also field questions and things like that. So there's a lot of different, gears working in one big machine on how we can communicate these things. It even goes down to every single time that we publish the Figma library, we have detailed release notes of what's inside of that
Cool.
Figma update, and people can see that. Yeah.
I have a take on this, and it is that no one reads anything. That period. That no one reads anything. So that's why it's really hard for me to say, hey, we're gonna like Miranda's saying about, here's an announcement, here's some docs, here's this, here's that. All of that, in my opinion, is CYA. It's basically saying, look, we put out the documentation, it's your fault you didn't read it. And that from a user standpoint actually feels bad, right? Because like, oh, I didn't read the docs, it's my fault that I didn't read the docs, right? Or on the flip side, that we put out documentation from a design system perspective and it didn't have the thing that they were looking for. Now we feel bad because we missed something, right? So it's feel bad both ways. And I unfortunately, I know this is not a documentation webinars. Otherwise, I would talk about an hour for this. But the bottom line for me is the reason for what we do is for folks to execute on stuff, right? We're in production environments. People are just churning things out. They're moving at a fast pace, whatever. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to get unblocked all the time. So when they're trying to get unblocked, they just need to get the thing done. And them stopping to read something is a roadblock for them. So there's a world where we can meet them in the space where they're working such that they can continue working in that space, right? And you can imagine maybe in like a code editor where you kind of like see the Tailwind, classes pop up in your editor. It makes it really easy to pick the right one, right? So like there's that. Maybe in Figma, there's a limited set of tokens that you could choose from to do this one particular thing. But there's definitely more to be done in that space because in some cases, you don't even know how to pick the right thing. And again, sitting down in documentation, I don't think is going to help. I think some of the more generic naming that we have for tokens, which I'm completely guilty of, also doesn't necessarily convey what to do with a token. So there is something missing in the education piece that, again, isn't them sitting in documentation, traversing it, getting lost, et cetera, stopping them from doing what they're doing. But there's also something that allows them to continue doing what they're doing, right? Maybe it's a co-pilot AI. It says, hey, it looks like you're trying to, use tokens for a button. Have you considered these, right? Something of that nature that maybe helps out in that way, such that, again, we're not just CYAing documentation. We're really, helping these folks along to make the right decisions without slowing them down.
Oh. I think do's and don'ts in those documentation is very helpful, but then a lot of times I'm actually seeing components being used in creative ways that I would not be able to guess the don'ts. So it's a tricky thing, but I think a lot of times sitting in meetings with them while they're developing things can help too. Just reviewing some of the designs that comes out of it, utilizing your design system.
Thank you. This is pretty insightful, and Donnie, you mentioned AI, and I know it's kind of everywhere, and we're gonna bring it into this conversation here. Tokens are structured data, right? So they're very parsable. They're very easy for a robot to figure out what's going on. Is there a place for AI to help token adoption in coding or designing, right? Donna, you mentioned like, hey, the pop-up can, you're typing and it just auto completes for you, right? That's on like the development side of this. On the the generation side of this as well, there's something that AI could potentially help us with, right? Like make me new tokens that might be missing, right? Might have gaps in our system. Do any of y'all have experience yet with this, right? Or is it just a glorified linter for our code? Talk to me.
I got something for you. So I've been working on a book actually that talks about mise en mode, which is the technique that I've been pushing around a little bit. And one of the things that I landed on in writing that was this idea that when you look at a immense token set, and you get overwhelmed by the number of values that you need to apply to that thing, what's really interesting is that you have a understanding already of what you want to do in your head, right? I want to convey knapsack in a Valentine's Day way. Well, why can't we just have AI say, you already know what knapsack looks like. You could traverse its pages and determine this is what knapsack is supposed to look like. We could feed it what Valentine's Day is supposed to look like. Please take those two concepts, put them together, right? Give me the structured data that assigns, what it means for a button to be in Valentine's Day for knapsack, and then associated with the correct token, right? Any of the 200 people that's in the chat, steal the idea, make a startup for it, okay? Please, honestly, please. I've been to AI conventions asking them about this exact,
it's all just data,
framework. Yeah,
right?
I want them to do this. I want an AI to look at a UI and say, I understand this, and I can create structured data that it represents this, that could then be assigned to tokens, right? Because what that does, unfortunately, it does take some designers' jobs away, right? I was talking about that role of the marketer that would have to go ahead and assign values to each one of those tokens. That's gone. And now what gets introduced is the ability to tweak and say, well, knapsack actually looks like this now, right? Or Valentine's Day actually looks like this now. Or we need to introduce dark, and what does that mean, right? So now we're talking about a different kind of role that isn't just you sitting in a dark room assigning values to tokens. It is instead trying to influence the thing that's going to eventually assign what it means to be knapsack and Valentine's Day to these properties. So I think that's a really great place to be honing AI, because the amount of time it takes to curate tokens, I did a survey on this a couple of years ago. It can take almost 2 hours on average to determine what value is supposed to go with a token, right? You multiply that number by the number of tokens that you have in your system, that's how long it takes to curate an entire theme, okay? So you can just think about the number of tokens you have right now, times that by 2, and that's hours. And in some cases, that's an entire sprint. And I know Garth's in the chat, but in Adobe's case, that's an entire month. So that's a long time. And I think we could definitely do better in that case, especially using AI.
I want to see AI implement my tokens.
Yeah.
I want to see a world where this migration that we're doing, where we're backing tokens into our system, I want AI to handle that. I don't know that we're in the position yet, given our life cycle currently, to have it create new tokens or help us with new theming or exactly what Donnie's describing. I think there's a future for that. I think when we're working with partners and new retailers and new business investments, like that has a perfect opportunity. But I think that's something that's more applicable, at least in our case, is how can we get tokens used across everything, especially since we're coming from a world where people are hard coding things or they're using the primitive layer, and we've got to like help teach them that. We've got, like anybody, hundreds and thousands, billions of lines of code. And when it comes to changing something, it takes so long to make sure that things are looking and rendering the way that we want, whether or not that's a manual audit or we're using some kind of tool like Chromatic or whatever it is that you want to see to screenshot test, whatever. I think back to this time last year where we simplified our type ramp and we changed our type tokens and we mapped 38 down to 5 different type tokens, and the effort in which it took to look through all of that and check it out and make sure that we're working the way that we want to and it's represented the way that we need it to be, and then it's actually using the right type styles, or it's using the back end strings that are not actually being changed. Like, that's where I think AI has a lot of value, because that's the kind of menial work that means
Yeah.
a lot for a design system, but it's very hard to get feature teams or even the space for a design system team to have the runway to do that work. But that's the meaning of it, right? Like, that's where you say, you want something to be able to flip a switch and we want to be Valentine's Day next Friday? Cool, we can do that only if tokens are like implemented correctly. And so everybody loves that future, but like the work to get there, the reality and the step by step and the code line by line you have to go through in order to integrate those tokens, that's the hard sell, but that's the work that really matters. And so that's where I want AI to go.
Yeah, definitely. It's like, Miranda, what you're saying is like, if data is garbage, garbage in, garbage out, and then the same thing
Yeah.
with how design tokens are applied. If it's applied incorrectly, then it's useless. But Donnie, you're up to something, because the whole idea of how AI is possible is because of all these tokens and the systematic way of mapping things. And if that is doable, then there should be a way for AI. Maybe we should start something.
I mean, this gets into, if I could just bring, Knapsack into this a little bit, because, this is my baby. Right? We always talk about with our tokens as as structured data, right? If you can store something as structured data, it can be parsed, right? And, everything in Knapsack is structured data, all of the content, all of the props, all of the, especially our entire tokens engine. And, one of the things that we talk about with tokens to folks who are looking at Knapsack is just like, hey, once you have this and it's easily accessible, right? We provide this for folks that use Knapsack. You can do anything with this, right? Miranda, you mentioned like, hey, can we have it backfill all of the stuff that's not using tokens, right? The idea of being able to say like, find every hard-coded value in my code base and try to find the closest potential token value to that is we've had that for a couple of years in AI, right? Like it's right there and it's so easily parsable once it's data. When we were only storing tokens, think back a couple of years ago, we used to just store it all as like, I don't know, SAS variables or, pre-CSS variables, right? We didn't put it as data. And we only had this idea of like, hey, maybe this should be JSON. In the last couple of years, I think there's a lot of unexplored ideas. Donnie, right? You told the audience, hey, go make this startup, right? Like there is a huge potential here, and it all starts with the structured data of tokens. And, you know, Knapsack loves to store data as structured at rest. We are right at the time for QA, and I'd like to get to some QA questions from the audience here. There's a lot. I'm just kind of read through these. Some of these are questions from back when we were talking earlier. Let's see if we can kind of run through these really quick. We got a question here. How would you go about onboarding design system users to use tokens of their work? Basically, it's an onboarding question. We talked about documentation. We talked about you know, office hours. Anything else around onboarding and teaching new folks how to use this stuff?
We have a session that every new hire designer goes through. And we have them review, you know, basically the primitive level stuff. So all of our atomics, talking about the type, talking about our base level colors. And that's simply just because we don't have a semantic layer to tokens yet. But we do make a point to get in front of folks when they first join, mainly because we also use it as an opportunity for us to gather as much information from them as possible before their bias changes to the way that our company works. Like, once you start using the system, tell us all the stuff that sucks so that we can fix it. It's a great opportunity for that. But when it comes to teaching them about tokens and how to use them, we give example UIs, we go through components together and we explain those principles on an individual level. And fortunately, that's because of the size of our team and the number of folks that come through on a monthly basis. It's definitely difficult to do at scale, but that works for us.
Awesome. Here, I'm going to grab another question from the audience here really quick. Why does naming tokens even matter? For example, why not use a unique hash ID for the name and then set of descriptions that go in the IDEs, right? Why don't we just call all of our tokens X297, right? Why even give names?
Humans are the problem. As usual, humans are the problem. That's what's going on, is that some human needs to read this. You know, it was interesting because there's a video flying around right now with two AIs that are talking to each other in English, and then they realize that each other is AI, and then they turn and they say, "Hey, can we just use like computer code to talk to each other?" They're like, "Yeah, let's do that." And they're like, beep, 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 beep. So like, it's very interesting how fast they were talking. Which, yeah, absolutely. If everything just hashed and the computers are just talking to each other, yeah, we don't need this anymore. In fact, that AI world that we're talking about, saying like, oh, you know, just assign the values and move on with no human intervention, absolutely, make them hashes. But like I said earlier about the reason why the primitive tokens exist is because of humans. And because humans are still doing this work, we still need to make that easy for humans to understand why we're doing all this stuff and where it's supposed to go. Until, you know, the machines take over, they'll continue to be non-hashed IDs.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon the naming because it really reflects what your organization is, the value of your organization, and what you price as the important thing to you. Like, just want to reflect back on my Chinese name. My Chinese name, I have my family name, and also I have my generation name, and then I have my own name, right? So if I introduce someone to my family member, if I'm at a family gathering, if I say my name, then people know where that generation name, which generation I belong to. That goes back to the culture, my culture, value, relationship, and where you place within that relationship. So that, again, that goes back to humans. Humans are involved. So if we follow the same logic and we communicate the same value, then great. If you understand the lexical of whatever you just mentioned, everybody else understand the same thing, great. All powers to you. But if there's a disconnect, that becomes the problem.
Awesome. Another question. How do we encourage or instruct designers and engineers to break, it says, it in a way that they can more easily come back? I think that means how do we allow them to make changes or find gaps and feed that back into the system? Is that just pull requests? Is that just like tapping somebody on the shoulder and being like, hey, there's a gap here?
Yeah, I mean, the system isn't perfect because going back to the flesh is weak thing. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks,
Humans are the
Chris.
problem, and we're going to make mistakes and need to improve and iterate and et cetera, et cetera. You would think that we would have figured out how to make a button by now, but maybe that isn't the case. So it's entirely possible that we need to improve on some things. I do know, and it's interesting that Garth put that question in, because looking at Adobe Spectrum, one of the things that my team looked at was the fact that if you override something in their library, not necessarily tokens, but more so styles, it actually removes all of the styling underneath it. And it kind of says, oh, you want to update the styling here? Well, now it's all on you, right? Now it pushes back and says, hey, you want to do one thing? Well, you're going to do the whole thing, right? Because we made some important decisions in here. And if you think you can do better, then you're doing the whole thing better. And I'm confident that some of that, and I'm sure Gar could say some things to this, but I'm sure some of that informs what to actually improve in that button, right? So if you continue to see that same change happening, not exactly what you intended, thanks, Garth. If you could see what's going on in that system, you can then improve it because of what's going on in there. But Garth will go in the comments and tell me what's really going on, because again, it's only what I'm seeing from the outside about what I'm assuming in there, but he can say more on that.
Awesome. What developer experience or tooling plugins make it easier for your team to use tokens? There's like IntelliSense, Explanation. Obviously, we've got a lot of AI agents now and a lot of our developers. What have you found that makes it easy to just hit a button and see what's available?
Linting's been pretty good for us. I will say from the Figma side of things, we invest a lot in building our own personal plugins as well, because we're trying to get engineers involved in Figma at a better level so they understand what they're looking at. Obviously, they have features like Code Connect and stuff like that will help. We have not implemented that, but at this point, it's pretty minimal. Curious what others are doing.
When I was working with Token Studios, we were able to push out a JSON file, and within that JSON file, it has all of the tokens that we could utilize. And then also we use Knapsack, and we also publish our tokens there too, so it is available for everybody to see.
Excellent. All right, we are right here at the end. I wanted to thank everybody for awesome conversation around this stuff. No fistfights this time. That was definitely an improvement. Uh, Last little thing as we finish up, we've got weekly demos for Knapsack every Thursday. Tune in, check them out. Just showing off what we do. It's pretty fun. Take a lot of questions from the audience as well. Also, in March, we've got this new thing in Knapsack called a consumer role. Tune in every week, find out what that's all about. And Donnie, Miranda, Jackie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being here. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about tokens. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for
Have a
having
great
us.
day, guys.